Hello, my name is Virgil, and today I'd like to talk about Grady Hendrix's Paperbacks from Hell. Uh, this is a really wonderful book, kind of a love letter to that classic horror fiction from the 70s and 80s and kind of verging into the 90s and maybe even a little beyond, and even really a little before the 70s. I think it even goes back to the 60s. And just sort of the kind of talks about the genre and how it had evolved from what it used to be, which was much more of a, I don't know, like the weird fiction of like a Lovecraftian era or sort of gothic ghost story type fiction, to a much more pulpish and much more blatant and explicit genre that really tried to shock the reader, that really tried to do something, that really tried to scare you, or just to be sort of insane. And the covers that were created for those books to sort of sell them in a cheaply produced paperback on like probably like spinning racks or something like that, or whatever store. It's a really fun journey. It really is. Exploring books that, for the most part, you maybe have never heard of in a genre that sort of has gone away. I mean, that horror is not gone, but I mean, if you went to the horror section in your bookstore right now, I mean, what would you find? You would find Stephen King, Dean Koontz, probably Anne Rice, maybe some Lovecraft, maybe like some John Saul, or I'm trying to think. There's a couple other writers. There's maybe a handful that you would find, and you might find a choice selection by somebody else. You're not going to find a breadth of different authors. You're mostly going to find the stuff that sells, which is Stephen King. And this book also kind of made me realize something interesting, is that we sort of think of Stephen King as being like this genre-defining writer. And I'm not saying that he's not, but he was writing fiction when he was writing that stuff that was the same as everybody else's. He just happened to be more successful at it, probably because his quality of writing is a little bit better, and he maybe just sort of understood the genre and what maybe knew what was going to sell. It's not necessarily that his books are amazingly like head and shoulders better than other writers at the time, but he was more prolific and maybe sort of knew what the market needed, knew what people wanted, and then that just sort of self-perpetuated itself, sort of snowballed into success. That makes it seem as though he doesn't deserve the success that he has, and I don't agree with that. But I think there's a factor there, because I think there's a lot of other writers from that time period that wrote stuff that's just as good as Stephen King, or certainly that holds up, but that are gone. I mean, it seems weird that all these people are writing all these books, and the only ones we really, really know about are maybe 5 or 6, right? I mean, even I would struggle to name maybe 10 horror writers from the 80s. It would be difficult to do that. I don't know that I could do that right now, especially if you tried to like eliminate writers that are like still super popular, right? Like if it wasn't like Stephen King, Anne Rice, and Dean Koontz, you would start to sort of like struggle to name horror writers, that weren't big names. So this is kind of this great love letter to those sort of forgotten books and the covers that they use to sell themselves. And it's really beautiful. I actually highly recommend it. I think for the price, I think regular retail is like $26.99, so $27. For $27, is worth just the art alone, just the quality of the art, which is this really kind of glossy-ish paper, sort of, well, I guess matte in a sense, but just these great images all throughout here, these just bonkers covers. I just love this stuff. It's a lot of fun. It's worth it just for those images. If this book had very little text and just those images, it would be worth the price of entry. And then Grady's sort of really excellent cataloging of these different books, and I get the feeling that, to at least to some extent, that he read most of the stuff that he brings up here. I don't know that he's read it all, but I get the feeling that maybe he did, or that he read most of it, like maybe 80% of the stuff. At least that's what I think, and that's awesome. I really love that this is sort of like a preservation of that genre of fiction and an era of fiction. It is kind of interesting to me to think that horror sort of like faded out, that the kind of horror that we have here is just sort of gone, and the market's kind of gone. I think there is still a market there if you look at like more independent writers or smaller publishers. I think that stuff is still there, but it's definitely not a genre where you can go to the bookstore and find one. This is really just, I don't even know if this is a real review. This is where I come on and say, I think this book is great and you should go get it if you have any interest in it at all. But there's one more thing here, and that's the first book that gets mentioned in here. I think it's the first book that gets mentioned in here is John Christopher's The Little People. Now, I recently did a review of John Christopher's Tripod trilogy. I know it's more than a trilogy. I made a kind of little mistake there. I think originally it was a trilogy, and the sources I looked at called it a trilogy, and I knew there were more books, but I thought, oh, those are additional. There's only one more book. It's a tetralogy, so it was a mistake on my part. But anyways, and I really enjoyed that series, and I did a review of it. Now, the first book mentioned in here is John Christopher's The Little People, which is a horror novel, and it is maybe one of the most bonkers horror novel ideas I've heard in maybe quite a while, and it's just great. I really love the cover. I love this presentation of what it's going to do, so I bought it. I'm going to try to read it and talk about it before October 31st, hopefully. So it showed up today. So the cover that Grady mentions in here is this one. I'm going to try and show you. It's pretty great. Yeah. So that's pretty amazing. And it's about these sort of like Nazi leprechauns that are also like have some sort of weird sex obsession. Now, to get the book with that cover is like stupid pricing right now. Probably because this book has sort of made an interest in collecting that older fiction for those covers. So that's probably what's driven it up, and it's just an older book, and John Christopher is kind of a known and desired writer. So I couldn't pick that up. I was looking at prices. They were over $150 for a paperback book. No, I'm not going to pay that. I don't know what I would do with at that point. Am I going to frame it? I don't know. So I was able to pick up the book, but with a much more somber cover. This is The Little People. Ooh, I'm getting lots of glare there. So I'm going to read this book and talk about it. My goal is to have this read and finished and talk about it before then. But I kind of want to do something. I'm going to do a little experiment here. I want to try something. I'm going to do a before and after. So my before impression is this sort of crazy sort of just sort of like almost feels like a kitchen sink type book. Like I'm just going to throw all this crazy stuff in, and it just seems I'm very intrigued because John Christopher's Tripod series is so maturely handled and so well written. I was really sort of impressed with how the skill of writing that he had to sort of bring you into the story and really develop the story well and handle things well. And that book is young adult fiction, and it seems very very, very like made for TV in a sense of like very homogenized, not nothing nasty or explicit or graphic in it. So it has a sense of like, so this Christopher in my mind has this impression of being very kind of like controlled as far as like what he'll put in his stories. And this book is like all the collar's off, like the chain is loose or whatever. And it's just insanity. So I'm very interested. So I'll read the back real quick. John Christopher's The Little People. The Irish countryside can be the most beautiful place on earth. Daniel and Bridget thought so when they moved to the old castle she had inherited in that remote part of the land. But there was something wrong with the castle and its sinister past. Something horribly wrong. The mysterious visitors in the dead of night were only the first signs of this escalating nightmare, which could only end one way, in terror. So it just, the sort of way that Grady puts this sort of front and center in the book, sort of like an example of like really crazy covers, really crazy horror fiction, just seems so opposed to what I've read of Christopher so far. So I think this is going to be a lot of a fun experiment. So I have cautiously high hopes for this book to be insane, and it'll be interesting to compare John Christopher's writing from the Tripods to this insanity, or at least what's supposed to be insanity. It sounds a lot more measured here, but we're just going to see. We're just going to see. I mean, what the Paperbacks for Hell, what it talks about, it just makes it sound nuts. I'll give you what Grady Hendrix sort of says about this book, which is from the introduction to Paperbacks from Hell. In it, a gorgeous secretary inherits an Irish castle from a distant relative and converts it into a B&B to show her patronizing lawyer fiancé that she can stand on her own. On opening weekend, the house is full of guests: an Irish dreamboat alcoholic, 2 bickering Americans with a hot-to-trot teen daughter, and a married couple who met in a concentration camp where he was a guard and she was a prisoner. But some uninvited guests were lurking in the basement. The Gestapos. The Gestapocons. The Gestapo. The Gestapocons live in the dark, battling their ancient rat enemies with tiny bullwhips. Shortly after we meet them, the author lets us know that they are not just any Nazi leprechauns. They are psychic Nazi leprechauns who employ S&M and are covered with scars from pleasure-pain sessions with their creator, were trained as sex slaves for full-size human men, and are actually stunted fetuses taken from Jewish concentration camp victims, and one of them is named Adolf. So that was the presentation I had for this book. So to say that I have a lot of interest in seeing how the writer of the Tripod series is going to handle this is an understatement. Well, that's it. I'll check back in maybe when I'm about halfway through this book, and then I'll come back and do a final thing to say when I'm done. I think it'll be an interesting experiment to sort of see like what I think a book's going to be like, what it is like as I'm reading it, and then what I think at the end after I thought about it for a second. I don't know, kind of a fun experiment to have. So definitely my impression going into this book is one of those, it just seems like I said, a kitchen sink book, like anything's going to get thrown in. So it's going to be a very interesting read. That's it. Thanks very much for watching. Consider liking and subscribing if that's something you're interested in. Well, my name is Virgil. This is Literally Books. Bye.